This fall art project, part 2, I'm going to be sharing with you how to construct these star blocks, how this whole quilt goes together, and some finishing techniques. You'll want to stick around to the end because I have some special embellishments that I'm going to add in that you won't want to miss. So let's get stitching. Now it's time to construct our star blocks. So we have our 5 different fall colors that we'll be using. We'll be cutting these into triangles. These are our corner squares. This is the center square, which will be on point. And this large black patch is going to be cut into 4 triangles so that we'll have a total of 8 total for the 2 blocks. So let's get started. We'll cut these into triangles as well. There'll be a couple of extras when we're done cutting. We won't use all of these. I like to use a piece of poster board as a design board. So then once I've designed it, then I can just take it over to my sewing machine. So this is how, this way I can really look at it before I take it over to the sewing machine and start stitching it together, but I can keep everything organized. So now we can take it to the sewing machine and start sewing these components together. I'll start here and in the center, sewing this together. Then I'll do these triangle pieces that are on the outside, and then we'll start sewing them into rows. So let's get stitching. I have my board here so that I can stay organized. I'm going to shorten my stitch length to 2.0. And let's start by doing this center block. You want these tails to be extending past your center block by 1/4 of an inch. Using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to do the other side the same way. We're going to finger press these down, like so. I'm going to go ahead and trim off these threads before we move on to the next unit in our block. You can finger press, or if you want to take the time now and press that flat, you can. So let's do these side triangles. Try to get everything lined up as best you can. These pieces are cut on the bias, so try not to stretch them. Gently move them into place. And there we have our next unit, and that's lining up beautifully. I have everything pressed and trimmed, so let's start sewing our rows together. Finger press. Now with these, because we want to try to match up those points, you do want to do some pinning. And I will go from the back side to the front, make sure that I'm in that point, and then place my pin right in the point of the next block. And if you do this sort of movement, it can shift the bottom one, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep this pin so that it's running through those points and staying equal. So I, a lot of times, will just bring another pin in just to make sure that they stay aligned, and go ahead and remove that pin. And then when I'm sewing, when I come up to that point, I try to stay just on the outside of where that cross is. And that way, when it folds over, the point stays intact, because we're going to lose a little bit when we press it open. And you can see here, the cross is just below that stitch line. So then when we flip it over, you can see that it's a nice, perfect point. If you choose to go for perfection. You don't have to, and sometimes I don't. By no means do I want you to feel that you have to strive for perfection. This is quilting. It's supposed to be fun. It's fabric. I am going to use my stiletto, because this one, for some reason, is wanting to shift and wanting it to stay right where I want it. And this works great. This is a stiletto by Annie. I don't know if you've ever used any by Annie products, but they are definitely top tier. And I am a fan. I have met Annie, and she is a lovely individual. So there you go. And I think we will press this seam to the inside, finger press to the inside, and have those outside going the other direction. So now we will sew these 2 rows together. Again, matching up our points. Keeping our pin level. Secure that point together. And to reduce the bulk, we'll have the smaller section going to the outside, and this larger section will have these side seams going to the inside, and you can just place a pin there and line everything up. Because we want to have as nice of a nested seam as we can get. Try not to sew over your pins. Let me grab my stiletto just in case I need it. Perfect. Get these. See, this is where the stiletto comes in handy. Let's see how we did. Oh, look. Now, I'm thinking that's pretty fine. So we'll do the last, we'll attach this last row. So there you have it. We've got some nice looking points there. I'm going to take this over to the iron and press this out, and we'll see what we've got. So our star block is all pressed out. You can see how nice our points look, and it's measuring 8" by 8". And I'm going to go ahead and make the other one, and then we'll start putting some of our components together for this beautiful art quilt. The first step of putting our art quilt together is going to be to square up our marquee block of our crow. And I have a 14 by 14 square ruler. And we need for the crow to be 13.5" by 13.5". And you can see that some of our edges are a little bit distorted. That's the reason why I have you cut the block a little bit bigger before you start, so that we can get it all lined up. So we're going to start by squaring up 2 sides, and we need our block to be 13.5 by 13.5. So we'll trim off some here and just a little bit on this side. And you can see that I'm using the grid here to make sure that he's not twisted and then he's kind of centered. So something to keep in mind before you square up your block. And we'll do the same thing on the other 2 sides. It'll make it much easier now that we have 13.5, have it cut down to 13.5 to square up these other 2 sides. And if you don't have a ruler that's big enough, you can also do it with a 10" ruler, just doing 1 corner at a time. That's another strategy. So let's go over to the design wall and let me show you how all of this goes together. So you can see that I have placed our first checkerboard border strip up on the wall, and then we're going to add an inner border strip, and this is for the crow. Everything won't line up perfectly because of the seam allowances, but I wanted to show you some of the areas that you want to look out for. And now we have our two side checkerboard borders. The one thing I want you to be aware of is when you're attaching these borders, you want the black to be over the white and the white to be over the black. And you can see it's the same on the right side. So that can be a pitfall, keeping track of the order of the checkerboard. So I wanted to point that out to you. We'll put up our two side sashing pieces for our feature block of the crow, which will go right here in the center. We have one more orange sashing piece for the bottom of the crow. Another checkerboard sashing piece that'll go across. And then we have our two star pieces, or our two star blocks. And these are just going to go side by side. Look at the orientation of the leaves if you've applied those. And then we have our two short sashing pieces. Again, notice how we're continuing with this checkerboard effect. And then one last piece. What I recommend is that you start by stitching the two side sashing pieces to your feature block, and then the top and bottom. And then I would go ahead and do the two stars together. And then it's just a matter of attaching the borders at that point. And it's pretty basic sewing. So let's get started. So you can see how that these sections have been sewn together, how it condenses down and it's going to match up to the top. I know it looked a little iffy at first. So now we will attach these three strips to our feature areas, and our quilt top will be done. And we'll be ready to sandwich it with some batting and add the backing. And I'm going to show you how I use a walking foot to quilt these borders. Super easy, beginner friendly. You just have to know where to look and where to point your foot. So let's get this finished, put together, sandwich, and start quilting. So now we have our art quilt all constructed, everything's sewn, pressed nicely. I went ahead and used this mottled fabric that I had because I had more of it. I was kind of running low on black, believe it or not. And so I like to use safety pins, and I will pin it in a grid fashion, removing them as I quilt, which is pretty standard practice. This being a art quilt, it is easy to handle. It's not like one of the conventional quilts that you might do for a bed where you have a lot that you're handling. Sometimes it can feel like you're wrestling an alligator. But I just like to pin in a grid. And as far as my quilting plan goes, I'm going to start by doing some cross hatching and doing some crisscrosses. And I'm going to actually use the thread that I used to thread sketch the crow with, which is a variegated black. So I'll show you that technique, and we'll be using a walking foot. This orange border, I'm going to actually be doing a series of circles and creating like a bead effect around here. And I am going to do it in the dark color. The background of our feature block, I am not going to be going over the areas where we've thread sketched, but I am going to quilt down this off-white background. And I want it to almost look like wind. So I'm going to do some wavy lines that undulate around. And with these stars, I'm just going to outline and accentuate these blocks, and I will use the dark thread for that as well. We will go back in and do some thread sketching on these leaves that I fused down to get these centers quilted down a little bit. So let's get quilting. So now we're ready to start doing our quilting. I'm going to start in the border area, and I have a fresh needle. I've cleaned out the races of my sewing machine of the lint from piecing the top, and it's all threaded, fresh needle. But I wanted to show you how to attach a walking foot to a sewing machine. So you'll see that there's this fork that goes up and down, and what it does is it lifts these feet up and down as the machine moves forward. The important thing is that it needs to go over. There's a little bar here, and this is where you tighten down the screw for your sewing machine needle. And so it needs to go over that. And this is pretty standard with most machines. Your machine may vary a little bit, but with a Bernina, that's how it is. This is one of my favorite feet, and I keep it out and handy all the time. So to create this cross hatching that I'm going to do, I'm going to start in the corner, and we're going to go from the corner to the next intersection to the next intersection, and then we're going to pivot and come back down this way. And we're going to do it multiple times, but it's just a really great way that I found to do this technique. And notice I'm not drawing any lines. But I'm going to show you where you want your foot to line up in order for you to be able to do this and not draw all the lines on. Of course, slow down when you get to the corner, because I do want to stay off of that orange band. So we'll turn our quilt, and I'm going to be doing it in such a way that I'll be leaving 1/4 of an inch, and that is for the binding. So these pivots need to be at 1/4 of an inch out from the edge of the quilt. So this mark on my foot is the 1/4 of an inch. So I'm actually going to be targeting this point right here, which should make my needle land about there when I get there. So as we approach, now we can pivot. I don't know what's going on there. And when we're headed towards the inside of the quilt, we don't have to worry so much about targeting that 1/4 of an inch. It's only when we're out here, because we want to preserve that 1/4 of an inch on the outside edge of the quilt. Perfect. And we'll do it again. Notice where I think before I go, it's interesting that when I turn that this is happening here. So I'm going to go ahead and check that out. What is going on? Ooh, we've got a messy business back here. So we'll be taking that all out. I'm so glad that we checked that. And I'm going to leave this in the video so that you can see that sometimes things don't always go as planned. And if you've been quilting for any amount of time, we obviously have some sort of problem. So we need to investigate. So let's start by rethreading our top thread. checking to make sure that let's rethread our bobbin. And let's test our stitch before we... I always keep one of these handy because I do a lot of decorative stuff, and this just... Okay, we're good to go now. Get this all smooth back down, but at least now we have some stitch lines, which wasn't the plan, but I think we can do one more. There we go. Targeting that corner. One more stitch, pivot. I'd love to hear from you all of what your favorite part of this project has been, and if you think that you'd like to try it. It's a very quick project to do. And heck, it's better than doing dishes, right? So now that we have all of our cross hatching done on the border, it's time for us to stitch down these blocks. They're a little loosey-goosey in here. And I'm going to stitch in the ditch, mainly because I'm going to use some 12 weight pearl cotton, and I'm going to show you how you can use this in your sewing machine and do some decorative stitching. And then we're going to free motion thread sketch these leaves, and then this section of the quilt will be done. So stitching in the ditch can be tricky. You just have to pay attention to what you're doing. And my goal is for to not see any of the stitching on the stars. Remember, that's a goal. This is definitely a time when you want to pay attention to what you're doing. I'm trying to keep the needle especially off of those white squares in our checkerboard. And there are just times when you have to go slow. You can't go fast. I just hit one of the white squares. So let me show you how easy it is to do some top stitching with a 12 weight pearl cotton. I've lined up my walking foot at the 8-inch mark on this foot, which is right inside. And we're going to do needle down, needle up, and bring our threads to the front. And you do want to go slow. You could do this by hand if you don't want to try to do this with your sewing machine. I've done both, but I wanted to show you how you could use 12 weight pearl cotton in your sewing machine. And you can see how smart that looks. I really like that effect. So tie off your threads and just bury them in the sandwich of your quilt. My normal sewing machine needle or sewing hand needle wouldn't work for this because the eye's not big enough. So you want to take the threads, try to get it in the hole that was created by the sewing machine. Here we go. And my goal is to get the second set of threads in the same hole so that it looks like they're seamlessly connected. And that looks pretty darn good. So you can see that's where it finished, and it just looks really nice. I'll finish this one off, and then we'll be good to start doing some free motion quilting. Let's give this guy a little stem. Now I'm going to start marking my sashing pieces for our marquee block here. So you want to use, this is a friction erasable pen, also comes off with heat, but test your pen to make sure that it will come off with heat before you mark, or use a chalk. And I'm marking at 1-inch intervals. And when we get to the end, we'll have to fudge it a little bit. And that happens where you have to kind of fudge. But we're going to do circles like this. And then just follow it around. I think on my original piece, I may have done 1/2 inch. This seems kind of big. So I think I'm going to take it down to 1/2 inch. Just like that, and we'll continue around. So now we're going to do our beads on this band around our marquee square. And I'm using the 9-foot for Bernina, and this is a free motion foot. And I wanted to show you that you don't have to have a stitch regulator to do this. It just takes some practice, and you might want to have a little practice sandwich. I've already tested this out to make sure that everything is threaded correctly. So we're good to go. And there you have it. We have our beads all done with 2 rows. Now we'll do our simulated wind background thread sketching or quilting on our marquee block. So let's start free motion quilting the background of the crow. So I have a light colored thread in my bobbin and a light colored thread, off-white thread in my top stitch. I'm going to go ahead and use this number 9 foot, and I'm going to do this without a stitch regulator. I want to show you that you can do this. So our goal is to make it look like there's wind in the background. So I'm just making wavy lines. So I have my seam binding here, and I've gone ahead and trimmed one of the corners at a 45-degree angle, and it's pressed in half with wrong sides together. And I'm going to show you how you can embellish your binding using the 12-weight pearl cotton, just like we did some decorative stitching on the quilt. We can now do that on the binding. And when I apply the binding, I'm going to apply it to the back of the quilt and then hand stitch it down on the front so that we can have this embellishment show. I'm switching out my needle to a top stitch needle, and this is a 100 by 16, which works great for this pearl cotton. And so what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch the binding. I'm going to start about a ½ inch away from this pressed edge, and I'm putting my 1/4 inch foot on the fold because this will be what is going to be on the front of our quilt. And if you want to make it a little bit more decorative, you can lengthen your stitch. I'm going to take it up to a 4.0. And just go ahead and stitch the whole length of your seam binding. You can see what this is looking like. And I actually think I might do yet another line of straight stitching on there, just to beef it up a little bit. So this 12-weight is a hand-dyed thread from Valdani, and they are starting to put it on a spool, so then you don't have to wind it onto a bobbin. You can just use it right off the spool. And I think they have some silk coming out too. We're just a little over a month away from going to Fall Quilt Market, and if you're familiar with the Houston Festival of Quilts,
market happens the week before, and it's where vendors like Valdani or Hoffman Fabrics and the various notion companies and fabric companies come together, and they show what they'll be offering presumably next spring. And so as a designer, I go and meet with the fabric companies and look at what they've got coming out. Generally, I already know, well, I know for Hoffman, and it's all super secret and nothing that we can share for the longest time. So I do know what's in those lookbooks, and I am thrilled to be featured in their lookbooks, and currently waiting for fabric. And I will be able to show it to you because the lookbooks are actually online already, so I can't show anything before they have their lookbook out. So I don't particularly like that. That was kind of a bummer. And that was where one of the seams were it did a little bit better there, but I say done is better than perfect. I'm going to press this real quick. Okay, so now we've got that little bit of puckering out of there. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do another one. I'm going to line up my stitch line with just inside of my foot here. And do another row of stitching. So if you're interested in, back to Hoffman, if you're interested in seeing what the fabrics that are coming out, they probably won't be hitting the stores until spring. So everything's in a much more advanced timeline. But if you go to their website, you can look at the catalogs. And one of my art quilts is in, I'll call it the more premier catalog. There aren't as many quilts or quilt patterns in it, but mostly just beautiful fabric renderings and a few quilts. And so one of my quilts is in there. It's called Blooming Azure. And then in the project book, there's a second, there are several new catalogs, but one of the other catalogs that they have is a project catalog, and so it has the fabrics in there, but then it also has a lot of patterns. And I believe I have 5 quilts in there. There's 2 art quilts and 3 conventional quilts. So I'm really excited to get those fabrics, and I'll be sharing them with you when I get them. So the next month is going to be really, really busy. I have a project for Valdani coming up that will probably, after I finish this, the Valdani project will be my next video that I put up. And that'll be very thread focused. And then that project will go with me to Houston and will be featured in their booth in Houston. And as far as the quilts that I would produce for Hoffman, I don't know yet what the plan is. So you can see that just adds just a fun little top stitching, and it will match with some of the top stitching that we did on the quilt. So I'm going to press this out and we'll start applying this to our quilt. So I have squared up the quilt and I have trimmed it. And I like to start my bindings on the bottom. And we're going to do this, we're going to apply it to the back like this, so that when we fold it over on the front, let me show you. When we fold it over in the front, this is what the binding is going to look like. I think that's going to look really nice. So right side to the back of the quilt. I'm using a walking foot, and we're going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this. I always trim my quilts 1/4 inch bigger than the top, and that is so that I can do this. Oh, I need to start over here. Had my stitch length elongated from making the decorative seam binding. Okay, so now we got our stitch length correct. So a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So then we fold it over, we have just a nice chunky seam binding. And you want to stop Oop, I went too far. You want to stop before the edge and then turn and pivot. And then you're basically creating a mitered corner there, and then you're folding the flap over and then butting your corner up to the needle and come back down. I always like doing something fun with seam binding. I figure if you have something fun planned, then you'll get it done. A lot of quilters sometimes have a tendency to get the top done. Sometimes they don't even quilt them. They sit around forever. And trust me, I have some unfinished quilt tops. But for me, I end up getting so busy with the next thing that sometimes I don't get to them. But I plan on that. I should do a series on all my unfinished objects. I'm pretty good. I haven't gotten any of those seams in my corners. I do try to not have those mitered seams land in a corner because it just creates so much bulk. Well, it's official. We were able to get around all 4 corners without a seam landing in them. Should we go buy a lottery ticket? Okay, so now, I know, there are those people that do all the fancy things with, but I'm going to show you TJ's way of doing this. So I'm lining that up, and I want it, and here's what I'm going to have on the front side. So I want to line this up so that it's going to lay underneath it, so about right there, and I'm going to cut it at an angle. And this is so we don't have to do that fancy little trick that everyone does. Yeah, it's nice, but need to trim just a little bit more. So you can pin this down. I hope you can see it. And then bring this right over the top of it. Place another pin. And then just lay that over the top, and of course you want to pull your pins out. Don't run over a pin. It's not good for your sewing machine, but it's not good for your pins either. And I like these fancy pins, and I don't like it when they get bent. Okay, so let's flip this over, and now what we can do is with these tails, we can just mimic that, and with the, we'll thread a needle and we'll just go in and out, and they'll all line up nicely. So now we're ready to go press all this to the front and get it stitched down.
I'm finishing off the seam binding by hand stitching it down to the front, and you can see how I'm aligning it to the points of the quilting that we did on the border to preserve those points. Once I finish with the hand stitching, you'll want to stay tuned because I'll show you how I attach and make the tabs, the hanging tabs, and I'm going to use a decorative stick to hang this quilt. To construct our tabs for the top of our quilt, you'll need a strip of fabric that is about 2.5 inches wide by 20 inches long. We're going to cut it into 4 5-inch segments to create the tabs. And I've gone ahead and pressed the length of the fabric with a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the back side. And I'm going to top stitch with some pearl cotton just to create some decorative top stitching that will show when we apply this to the quilt. I have finished top stitching the strip that we'll use for our tabs, and now we will cut it into 5-inch segments, and we're going to cut 4 of these. And with these tabs, we're going to fold it over, and you can go ahead and, with wrong sides together, stitch 1/4 inch and press the seam open. I have finished the tabs for hanging our art quilt. What I did was I folded the tab with wrong sides together and did a 1/4 inch seam allowance and pressed that open. And then measuring down 1.5 inches from the folded edge, because this is where we'll be hanging from, I went ahead and did a stitch line. We'll use this to line up on our quilt so that all the tabs will be the same length. And then I have a decorative stick that I'm going to be using, and you could get a decorative stick like this at a floral supply, Michael's, Joann's, or you could even just go to your yard if you have one and strip down a branch and use that. So all we have left to do is to stitch these tabs in place, and we're ready to hang our feathered foliage art quilt. Oh, one last thing, we need to add some beads to our crown in the eye. I've arranged our hanging tabs evenly across the top of the quilt, and I've pinned them to the back. The seam that we created is actually on the back side of this so that we won't see it. And I have lined up the stitch line with the edge of the seam binding. That way we know that the tab is the same height on all of them. And we'll just stitch them down. You can opt to not put the tabs on and put little hanging loops on the back or a hanging sleeve, whatever you prefer. But I thought that the stick that I had was a nice touch and made it a little more decorative. You could hang it on an outside door and dress up your front porch. So we'll continue in the same manner until we have them all done. Finishing touches on our crow. I have a black sequin here and an amber colored seed bead. So we'll thread that onto our needle and bring our crow to life with an eye. Just like that. Now let's add a seed bead and a sequin to his crown. I think he needs a little bedazzling. We have the beads on our crown and he has a little eye.
I've really enjoyed creating this feathered foliage art project for fall. Love to hear what you think in the comments. Until we meet again, happy stitching.